Okay. Our speaker is Fritz Kleinschroth, and I'm very happy that we could invite him here to WSL because he is working on very interesting topics that are interesting to us. So Fritz Kleinschroth is a senior scientist at the Ecosystem Management Group of the USIS department at ETH Zürich. And he is working on landscape approaches to integrate built infrastructures and ecosystems along urban-rural gradients. So he spatially tracks landscape transitions based on maps and remote sensing and analyzes them in the context of social and ecological processes on the ground. So his background is landscape planning at the Technical University of Berlin. He worked several years as an ecological consultant and habitat mapper in Germany. And he holds a dual degree PhD in forestry from Bangor University in UK and biodiversity and conservation from AgroParisTech in France. So now he will talk about his inclusive tools and spatial information to reconcile biodiversity conversation and land use in an urbanizing world. So Fritz, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Silvia and Catherine and Nadia for inviting me. Thanks a lot for joining. I'm very pleased to be at WSL, and I'm also pleased that you gave me quite some time to go a bit into depth about my journey here at ETH mostly, and I framed it as inclusive tools and spatial information to reconciling biodiversity, conservation, and land use in an urbanizing world. But I will start with something much more personal. So that's me in the age of 14. Back in northern Germany, and no, this was not about climate change yet. This was more about social concerns in our more locally where I lived. But I show it because like I was concerned with social issues quite early on, and I also believe that many of these changes need to come in a bottom-up way and cannot all be solved top-down through policy. Then my interest in biodiversity was mostly shaped by 1 year of work. Right after school, I had the pleasure and the privilege to count birds and do bird inventories, breeding bird inventories on an island in the North Sea in Germany. So this was a very important for me, like to get this this feeling for nature and for biodiversity. But it was also a good lesson to learn that biodiversity conservation is not all about inventorying species, but it's also about the people who live in the area and about their sense of place and their attachment to the landscape that they feel attached to. And conservation can only work with those people. And then a bit further on, I mean, this is much more recent, but I did quite a number of exchanges and internships in the global tropics, where I learned that landscape planning is also a question of competing interests and also about power dynamics globally, and we can only tackle global issues if we work together. And these things will come up throughout my talk. But I also want to show something that was very influential for me more during my studies. Like I studied landscape planning in Berlin. And one of the big themes there is urban ecology, also because of the history of the city, which has a lot of abandoned areas, like abandoned railways, such as this one, which give space for quite some wild nature in the middle of the city. And what I was strongly influenced by is like what just came out by Ingo Kovarik, who was my professor back then, and he shaped this as the Berlin School of Urban Ecology. And the foundations of this Berlin School is to approach urban ecology as an integrative science, to look at interactions between urbanization, humans, biodiversity, and ecosystems, to try out novel approaches to reconcile urban land use with biodiversity conservation, to look at evidence approaches to look at non-native species, and to work towards co-production, or I would call it co-creation of science planning and design, in this case, in the context of urban parks, but I have extended that way beyond to also to other subjects. So a bit to walk you through the contents of my talk now. I will start with an introduction about why is it actually quite tricky to save biodiversity in an urbanizing world, and why this requires adaptive management. And then I will show you some of the examples of different challenges and wicked problems that I have worked with. One is about floating vegetation invasions. One is about green spaces in cities undergoing densification, and more broadly about conflicting narratives on conservation and infrastructure development. And then I will present some of the tools that we have developed in the ecosystem management group. One is more spatial, like about drone imagery to create joint understanding of landscapes. And then another one is a mixing board, which we recently published to break down the complexities of integrated landscape approaches. And I will also give a short outlook of future work and try to synthesize some of the elements of my work. But I will start with a picture which I took quite recently. I think the posters are still out everywhere. And I'm showing this not because I think it's not important. Like, I think it's very important that people get engaged and vote and go to the website and support the initiative. But I think the pictures that are shown here are quite misleading and can actually be not so helpful for the cause of biodiversity conservation, because they show a situation which I think doesn't even exist in Switzerland. Like, we have like the completely bipolar images of a like idealized landscape where even agriculture and a small urban area are like kind of in conjunction with biodiversity. Fair enough. But on the other side, we have a wasteland. And I'm not even sure like how, maybe they manipulated that on Photoshop, but I don't think such wastelands really exist in Switzerland. Maybe when you build something and you kind of scrap up the vegetation, but I don't think these are the two alternatives that we are facing. Like, it's not, I don't think that's the challenge that we have to kind of restore wastelands. And yeah, that's kind of my take on that. Decisions are rarely black and white, and decisions for conservation of biodiversity are much more complex and very often wicked. And one of the reasons for that is that everything globally is connected, and we are facing urbanization all over the place. And the big question is that good or is that bad for biodiversity? We don't know. It's probably both. So of course, we're facing issues like urban sprawl. We're facing the big question, like what are the footprints of urban areas? We're facing direct and indirect changes of vegetation across cities. But we also know that if we want to support biodiversity within cities, it needs space for them. And we also, of course, need urban green space for public health. And the challenge is how to make them just green enough. And then the big question is like, how can we do cities maybe help us to concentrate the human footprint? Like this paper even says, so it's a breakthrough that we have urbanization because that allows us to concentrate the impacts. But there's also voices against that. So there's a lot of different opinions here, and they're also all much more complex and much more difficult than the black and white picture that I showed before. So what we're dealing here with, and that's something that in the ecosystem management group at ETH is a kind of a core theme. It's the question of wicked problems. So we have a lot of different conflicting objectives. We have a lot of different actors who have different interests from a limited area, like from the landscape. And very often we don't have a unique problem statement. Like, we don't know what is our common goal. And all this like in a context of uncertainty, like scientific complexity, but also political complexity and administrative complexity, which all lead to a situation where we have a lot of valid problem framings at the same time. And the maybe only way to deal with that is through adaptive and participatory management. So what we need is diverse and inclusive tools for landscape planning to allow people with different viewpoints, because those viewpoints will always exist, to understand each other and to find solutions. And I think these solutions need to be both spatial and non-spatial. So on the spatial side, there's like we need multiple analytic pathways for large-scale spatial data. And we also need small-scale spatial data to serve as what I call boundary objects, like things that a lot of different people can understand and can connect with, and that will then help them to work together. And on the non-spatial side, we need to allow pluralistic narratives of ecological knowledge and stewardship. And this needs to exist at the same time, but needs to communicate. And for that, we need to break down complexity into dynamic attributes. So this is a bit like the big goal of what I'm standing here for and what I want to bring forward. But I will now walk you through a couple of challenges that I have worked on in the last couple of years. It's a bit of a random selection, but I will start with floating vegetation invasions in urbanizing landscapes. And why I find these interesting is because they're so old already. Like already more than 50 years ago, there was this paper in Science which was a big, alarming paper about the big risk of aquatic weeds that grow proliferate very quickly and cause big issues, especially for hydropower operations, but also for fisheries and other more mechanic uses of the water. And this author back then, he called this as one of the symptoms of our failure to manage our resources. Well, we already failed 50 years ago, and a lot of effort has been put into actually fighting these invasions, like a lot of control campaigns, chemical, mechanical, also biological control. And I would say they all failed. Like not only our failure to manage our resources, but also our failure to manage these invasions. And we showed this through a global comparison based on dammed reservoirs. So there's a remote sensing approach that we took to look at 30 years of this coverage of these floating plants, and we show that this is only going up, despite all the efforts that have been going on also in these specific locations. And we framed our paper as living with floating invasion, because I think we need to find a way to, talking about adaptive management, to live with them and actually make the best of them. And we also need to understand the reasons, of course, and nutrient pollutions from urban areas is one of the main reasons. So we linked our observations of the coverage of the vegetation with urbanization trends, and we see quite a clear correlation here. And we also looked a bit more in what is happening with these invasions. So we know they're caused by urban pollution, but they also move. And that's very important part, that they actually take up the nutrients from the water, and they even only exist where there's enough nutrients. And then they actually have a function to transport these nutrients out of the system. So they're basically a nature-based solution to replace non-existent sewage plants, like wastewater treatment. And we did this together with biochemists from EAWAG, and they showed, based on field measurements, that in some of these areas where we detected large coverage, that quite a major part of the phosphorus and nitrogen is actually bound in those plants and then transported elsewhere. Of course, the question is, where is it transported? And one evidence that we found here in a small-scale landscape in Zambia was that through the flood, these plants are landed on the soil, and then they are plowed into the ground and actually fertilize the soil again. So it's a different way of I mean, it's a very, maybe not very controlled way of a sewage system, but it's a direct reaction to pollution with some effects. So that's some ways how I think we should look differently. We should change perspective, and that will help us much better towards adaptive management. A completely different topic, but also in the urban sphere, is something I've been working more recently, and that's about planning green spaces in cities undergoing densification. And to have a little bit of a warm up here, maybe I ask you in the audience first, like when you think back 3 years ago, the height of the COVID pandemic, the first lockdowns, how did you actually change your behavior in that time? So maybe you can all stand up, like who of you increased the use of urban green space? Like who of you went more often during the lockdowns? Maybe you can stand up to also kind of get some movement in there. Okay, so we have some. Yeah, so who of you increased? So I asked increased, right? I asked increased. So who went more? So and who went less than before COVID? Okay, so at least we have some. And who didn't change? Okay, well, very interesting, because this is not reflected in the science that we found. You will see the results in a moment. Yeah, exactly. Well, there might be a publication bias, but well, there's quite overwhelming evidence that at least in Europe, the use increased, and I use different like. I'm now working on different studies. Like this is the work by Dominic Beery, master student that I had the pleasure to supervise. And he actually wrote to community gardens in 6 different countries, to community garden managers, and asked them, how many applications did you have to participate? And not surprisingly, so this is 28 who actually gave numbers throughout the 5 years that he asked for, from 2018 to 2022. And he saw a clear increase over time. Now, the big question is that maybe even independent of COVID? So is the demand for community gardens in general increasing? Because exactly from 2019 to 2020, there was a stagnation in the demand, which is kind of counter the trend. So we have different, and we also saw it in your responses now, like we have quite some contrasting results in how people change their behaviors in terms of green space. And it's not like one of the common narratives was that, oh, COVID made us go out more, so we have much more appreciation for green space. But the picture is not that clear overall. And I mean, I was one of the first kind of to look into this, and based on Google Trends, like I found a big peak in that suddenly a lot of people were Googling for going for a walk during the first lockdown, and then again in autumn during the second lockdowns, like this came back again. But that was not enough for me as an evidence. So I went into to coordinate a team of people to run a systematic evidence review. So like all the literature published in the last 3 years, we analyzed it. I will not go into the details, but we screened 3,000 papers and came up with now 250 or so locations. And because everyone reported something different, I just coded them. We coded them in in which location did people increase, decrease, or not change the use of green space. And this is the change from before to during the lockdown. And we see quite a mixed picture here. So we see that especially like in Central Europe, there were quite some locations that reported big changes, like big increases. But in the rest of the world, that is much more mixed, the picture. And the question is like, what does this depend on? The first most obvious theory would be like people were just not allowed to go to green spaces. So it could have to do with policy stringency. So we used the Oxford stringency index to compare all these locations against each other. We also weighted by study quality. And this is not so clear. So these are 95% confidence intervals, like the error bars. and they're still overlapping. So it's not such a clear picture here. It becomes much clearer when we include the GDP per capita, like also spatially distributed and for each city. And then we see actually it has to do with wealth. Like it's actually those places where people are richer, they have the possibility to go out more. And that is most likely linked to availability of green space and distance. So that is for what happened from during lockdowns, and now we also looked what happened after lockdowns. Much less studies were available, and we see a much greener picture overall, so much more increases that were reported. And again, the picture was similar to what was before, but in terms of GDP, even clearer. So those areas that decreased their uses were on average poorer than the others. So we have, like when we talk about green space, we always also dealing with accessibility, both on global scale, but also locally. So it's a question of equity. And then the other question that we tried to answer was, how do different types of green spaces support or not support the use of their use during COVID? And here we see a big difference, not surprisingly, with private gardens. I wonder if this is working now. Maybe not really. Huh? Does it have to remain connected? Or? Oh, okay. Well, it doesn't matter.
But you can always use the mouse to.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, it's fine. I mean, I can just say left and right. So, so not surprisingly, private gardens only showed increases also during the lockdowns. I mean, that was the big privilege that people had to have their private garden. And also green spaces near home, like mostly increased. Whereas public parks and historic gardens, for example, because they could be closed and they tended to be overcrowded, they show mostly decreases. That changed a bit during, like after the lockdowns, because most parks were open again. We have still a dent in the unspecified green spaces. That is a methodological issue because most people used, or quite some studies used Google mobility data, and they had this very general park category, which didn't account for urban or not urban areas. But in both parts, we see that forests and nature reserves, so everything that's kind of natural areas in the urban sphere, like they showed mostly increases. And they were, in that sense, like a bit of a backup during times of crisis for people to cling to, because that's where they could still practice social distancing and use and be outside, which is certainly good for health also. So we need to pay closer attention to these kind of informal green spaces and support them. So how can we do that? I recently supervised a bachelor thesis by Frédéric Campbell, who actually just looked at how did different habitat types in Zürich change over time. And what he did was like to use existing data from 1987 and 2020. So quite a big time span of biotope maps, which are published by the city of Zurich. It's very tricky. I mean, you would think, oh, it's straightforward, but it's very tricky because the mapping standards were completely different back then and now. We can already see that on the overview map that the polygons were much bigger in the older mapping approach. So what he did, and I think he did quite a good job, was like to break this down into smaller and or generalize the smaller ones and get to a level where he could actually compare them of course, at a much broader level. And he came up with this change map. I mean, we can see like overall, like there is quite some stability, but if you look at the percentages in the rates of change, we see that in the city of Zurich, like buildings increased, maybe not surprisingly, that the city is denser now than it was in the 80s. We have quite some stable conditions in terms of forests, gardens, water and wetlands. But we have a lot of decreases in the agricultural area. So a lot of agricultural land has been given up and was transformed either into built up or into grasslands. And yeah, maybe the vacant land category is a bit broad, but also there we see big increases. So that's something like we can base our decision making on. And more broadly, there's Yu-Yang Chang, who is a PhD student, I have the pleasure to supervise, and he looks at policy incentives in changing urban greening. So there's much broader scale, so there's all across China, and he's comparing the National Garden City program that has been implemented now for the last 30 years or so. And he's looking at urban greening trends, especially like the indirect greening that happens inside city cores due to fertilization, gardening, but also climatic effects. And what he finds is that the effectiveness of urban greening incentives, so this Garden City program is the incentive, and the effectiveness strongly varies across climate zones. And that is likely due to lacking adaptation and maintenance costs. So now we heard about urban greening, which is more of a topic probably everyone agrees on the purpose. And the difficulty here is more how to actually get there. But now I also want to briefly talk about some problems where it's much more unclear what actually is the problem and what is the common goal that we have. And for that, I think it's important to understand that all research has a frame. Like we always come with a certain angle that we look at land use planning and water management, for example. But we're also dealing in the landscape, we're dealing with a lot of different narratives. And in this paper, I try to break that down to kind of find the common landscape nexus narrative between indigenous rights, economic modernization, and nature conservation. But what we ignored and what we've only found then was that we have a big elephant in the room here, which is a narrative which has to do with what people claim the living museum narrative. So we have an issue with an ignored culture context and the missing voice of local peoples and power relationships. And model-based optimizations, as we use them in this project and as many others use them also in the conservation sphere, are simply not enough to capture these diverse narratives. And one example for that is the global priority areas for ecosystem restoration. This was published a few years ago, based on a global kind of approach. But I would claim that the local context is completely ignored by such large-scale analysis. And we actually responded to this together with Sarah Lofquist, another PhD student in our group who recently finished. And we overlapped these priority classes with population density. And we show that the higher, like 20% of the highest restoration priorities that were defined globally actually have 1.4 billion people living in them. So these priority classes are actually not vacant land as we saw before that can be used for restoration, but it's actually inhabited, and there's cities and there's people who have very own interests in the land. And again, like linking back to wealth, like we also linked it with Human Development Index. And we showed that on average, the highest priority classes have lower Human Development Index. And that doesn't mean that all restoration is futile, but we need to think about giving local voices to the narrative and to the restoration. And that's what Sarah did actually in her PhD. And that's also something that I'm trying to work on with the different tools that I'm going to talk about now. So one of the tools is to use drone imagery to create a common understanding of landscape. So now we're zooming down a lot. One important thing to understand for that is that people perceive information, also visual information, differently. So what do you see here in this picture? A frog. So who sees a horse? Okay, and you know that picture already, or you see it just like this? Okay, well, I didn't see the horse at all. I hope now most of you can see the horse. Yeah, so just by turning it, like, we can completely change the perspective and we see different things. And drones actually allow us to do that for a landscape. So just by looking at straight down and looking from an angle at oblique already completely changes the story that we see. And we tested this together with different groups of stakeholders, also in a study in Zambia, which was published recently. So we gave them landscape images, like based on satellite, based on drones looking straight down, and based on drones looking at an angle. And then we asked them, how many landscape elements do you identify? Or actually, we asked them to identify with Post-its. And then we just counted the number of unique elements that each different group could identify. So here you see the images that we showed and the drones that they originated from. And we see from the left to the right, we see an overall increase in the interpretability of elements. So the video drone actually helps everyone seeing more elements. But, and that is the most striking thing when we look at the small scale farmers, which is the light blue box plot, they actually had, because they're untrained in it, like it was the first time to be exposed to these kind of straight down nadir views, they had problems identifying many elements there. But once it came to the more side views, they were actually at the same level with all the other stakeholders. So this new perspective helped them to actually be on the same page with all the other users and to talk at eye level about what is actually happening in the landscape. So that is very important for decision making. We often assume, oh, all the information is here, but we don't know who actually sees what in these images. And that was a relatively small study. So now there's Yilin working with her master thesis on doing this similar study again. Interestingly, she didn't support my findings. I mean, this is the preliminary results, but she actually showed, because there she used images exactly of the location where people are. And interestingly, she found that people found more elements in the straight looking down nadir perspective, probably because they know what is the area and they could identify better with it. Whereas I used in my study like a generic set of images of areas that people didn't know. So there's quite some more to explore here, actually. But I promised to also briefly talk about non-spatial approaches to landscape. I mean, this is a study that we published recently and that I actually was asked to present. I'm sorry that I will only shorten this a bit. So the state of the art in terms of landscape approaches was set in 2013 by this PNAS paper by Jeff Sayer and others who put out 10 principles for a landscape approach to reconciling agriculture, conservation, and competing land uses. And what they, like the main story that they tell is that landscapers tend to away from top-down engineered solutions towards more bottom-up negotiated actions that emerge from the process akin to modeling through. So modeling through is a science, and not only recently, but actually since 1959. So quite an eye-opener to have modeling through as, like in Germany, it would be Durchwursteln, something like this. To actually have it as a strategy. But of course, we wouldn't be scientists if we wouldn't want to still structure this process somehow and find some general rules to it. And that's what they did with their 10 principles. The problem with these principles is that they're often misunderstood as a tick list. So you have to do all of these in your process. And we try to find a more dynamic approach to them. So in this recent paper, we broke down these 10 principles into 7 characteristics that can be scaled and measured. So one is about learning, one is about motivation, one is about scope, power distribution, inclusiveness of the beneficiaries, accountability, and risk management. So if I invite you to read the paper to look a bit more into detail how we framed them and how we qualify them, because like I don't have the time to look into them into detail now. I just want to show you like the general principle of this mixing board is that for each of these 7 qualifiers, like we actually have like a Likert scale of 5 different switches, which can be turned on or off in a process of evaluation, and they cover the full range of extremes in each of these qualifiers. And the main question is like, what are the common attributes to compare and measure the complexity of landscape approaches? And that can then be gauged towards more or less complexity. And here's one example. This is a case study where I worked actually quite a while ago in Nicaragua. And this is and so far interesting because it's an individual initiative of farmers who came together and said, we want to protect the forest because it contains important water sources. So their learning and their motivation is more on the side of a common entry point, and it's quite predetermined, let's say. Whereas their focus is more in the middle between narrow and wide, because they include different elements of the landscape. But also, for example, the power distribution and the inclusiveness are more towards the end of being centralized and exclusive, because it's not a fully democratic process that is going on there. Also, the accountability is more on the horizontal side, and the risk management, since it's such a long-term initiative, is not very agile, let's say. So the overall complexity is more on that side. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. Like for this initiative, that's actually how it works. But we can now compare this with other initiatives, which may be much more on the other end of the complexity scheme, which always comes, of course, with costs also. So I invite you to look into this paper to go a bit more into detail, because I briefly wanted to also mention where I'm going now, let's say, or where we are going with a new project on visualizing daylight management in urban river restoration. And that the idea is a bit to combine the visual part that I talked about with the drones and the social part that I talked about with the mixing board. And this is like the starting point for that is something much closer to here. Actually, it's Zürich and urban streams. We also enhanced that by a Scottish case study, which is more about urban river woodlands. But yeah, the idea is like, can natural dynamics actually provide aesthetic and ecological counterparts under urban densification? And we will do that by testing new visualization tools to involve different stakeholders, for example, in issues around land ownership, security, but also the general acceptance of wild processes in the urban context. And the idea is like to have AI-based image editing, to have a before-after scenario already before the whole, for example, river daylighting, like the deculverting of a river happens. And this is a project which is now funded by Velux Stiftung. And I'm very glad that Matthias Buchacker is here, who will be one of the partners at WSL. And as you can see, like there's a number of other partners involved too. So that is coming up now. So now I have, let's say, 5 minutes for a synthesis. So I know that I threw a lot at you now, like a lot of different challenges, a lot of different tools. And I want to bring it back a bit to why are we doing that? Like, why are we talking about people so much. Like, why are we talking about social processes, about boundary objects, about visualizations, when we're actually worried about biodiversity? And I want to link to the quite recent global biodiversity framework, which is kind of the COP15, basically what is the Paris Agreement for Climate is the coming Montreal framework for biodiversity. And the target 1 out of 23 is that areas need to be under participatory, integrated, and biodiversity inclusive spatial planning to reach the goals of bringing biodiversity loss close to 0 by 2030. But to do that, we actually need all these tools, and we need to be inclusive also across scales and across different abstraction levels. And that is something that I'm trying with my work, like to reflect this diversity in approaches that we need. And maybe we can bring these approaches on these 2 scales, like local to global and narrow to wide scope or abstraction level. And I showed you now, like I talked about linking remote sensing of vegetation with water sampling in the example of the floating vegetation. And I talked about changes in green space use that indicates urban resilience. I showed you about urban biotope mapping, spatial analysis of urban governance. And we already cover quite a gradient here. All these are quite narrow because detailed questions, but we already cover a gradient from local to global, different scales. And then I talked about more pluralistic narratives and social considerations for restoration. So this is very global and very wide. And I talked about the drone imagery. I would place that a bit in the middle. And of course, the integrated landscape approaches are targeted towards detailed areas, local areas, but they're very wide in scope, intentionally, to cover all different aspects. And now I talked about visualizing restoration scenarios, which is somewhere in the middle as well, but with very localized scope. So what this teaches us, hopefully, is what is actually the core of inclusive landscape planning. And in Europe, that's widely institutionalized. I mean, spatial planning and all these policies are part and include participatory elements, but the underlying conditions, of course, need to be met. So we need these technical plans to be supported by pluralist views of ecological knowledge. We need to join spatial and non-spatial understanding. We need more dynamic approaches on how to use and conserve and restore ecosystem. We also need to think about ecosystem dynamics themselves. And we need strategic and integrated planning. And how I do that is was brought together by Christian Olmos, who did this very nice artwork based on the things that I told him are important for me. So maybe as a take-home message, maps are an instrument of power that we need to transform into an instrument of understanding. And with maps, of course, I mean all kinds of spatial information and tools, because the power of maps lies not only in the people who make maps, but also in the people who interpret maps, and they need to be able to understand them. And hopefully these different elements of learning, motivation, scope, and so on can help us to do better with these maps. And I'm framing this as how not to lie with maps, because there's a famous book called How to Lie with Maps, which shows how throughout history, maps have been misused to shape people's views and to implement certain power relationships. And to overcome that, because we want to overcome that, to build alliances for transformative change. That's the big challenge that we have ahead. And for that, we need to include free, prior, and informed consent of local communities in this. We need to complement top-down spatial analysis with culture and historical perspectives. We need more fluidity between binary and spatial categories. That links back to my initial picture that I showed. And we need to improve the accessibility of geoinformation across the data collection, the analysis, the visualization, to actually make people, put people in the situation to understand and get the same information, and based on that, find common solutions. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Fritz, for this very nice talk. And I like the picture of your portfolio. It's really, it replaces any CV also, visual CV. Very nice. So are there questions or comments on this talk from the audience? Yeah, Simona.
Thank you, Fritz, for, should I say? Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Fritz, for the presentation. I mean, you definitely covered a lot of things. I was wondering, since you placed the term inclusive at the core of your talk, and throughout the talk you discussed about participatory, which would be more people-oriented aspects, and biodiversity inclusive aspects. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you understand by inclusive and for whom. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, my focus is clearly on, let's say, like the biodiversity inclusiveness is kind of the big goal. So I didn't go into detail, or like I'm not exactly working on the, let's say, the species inventories and the, let's say, the assessment of biodiversity, which would be a crucial, like, kind of foundation to actually know, are we biodiversity inclusive or not? But I'm talking about decision-making processes where we want to, like, with the goal of biodiversity conservation. And the question is, like, how can we bring in the people in an inclusive manner, knowing that there are so many different land use interests. And if we are not inclusive, like if we only work with those people who are already supporting our work, I think we will fail, because it's not like the land users will continue in other ways. And that's how I understand the term. But like, when I understand you correctly, you mean that we also should think about being biodiversity inclusive in all kind of decision-making processes, right? Is that what you mean with it?
Not necessarily. I was mainly referring to the use of the term inclusive for people, like for certain social groups, inclusive for, I don't know, children or whatever other groups. And then I saw this, I would say, dichotomy, though maybe not the best word, since you said it's better not to have these opposing views, but it's like there are different perceptions of what inclusive means if it's for people, but then you refer more in your talk, I see, then on nature, like biodiversity to be inclusive. So it was this nature versus people opposition and how one could define inclusiveness.
Well, yeah, ideally it's really like to overcome this binary thinking. So to actually see people as part of the environment and the biodiversity as part of people's life. No? Like that's ideally both would be inclusive. But of course, there's big challenges ahead, and that's how I understand your question, that we're not there yet.
Okay, thank you. Any other question or comment? Yeah, Catherine.
So I was stuck on the biodiversity because I think a little bit like you, and coming just purely from the biodiversity side, and this idea of biodiversity inclusiveness I like, but it's super fuzzy for me in a way. So I wonder, like, if you just take one example and say, like, how in some ways did you ask people's perception of biodiversity a bit, and that sort of map that to what the different other decisions they were making were? And I don't know, I'm still struggling to see how you're connecting the two. So maybe with one of the many examples you gave to sort of show the connection, like, super explicitly for me.
Well, maybe your understanding of biodiversity is narrower than mine, let's say. So no, we, like, in those examples that we showed, and we didn't ask specifically about that. Like, we see it more, like, for example, when we look at the drone example, it's that could be the way forward. So, like, one of the next steps could be to actually test if drone imagery or different perspectives of drones can actually help to identify biodiversity better, like to really go at the species level. But there we only started at really landscape elements, so it could be anything. But we would still assume that, let's say, more diverse a landscape is, the more, let's say, complete is the picture that the people have in their heads, and that helps us to, let's say, to support the processes that ultimately lead to conserve biodiversity. But it's really not, like at this level, it was really not at the detail of asking how much biodiversity do you see there. It's more like kind of seeing the landscape diversity as a kind of as a proxy for biodiversity. And
okay, yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Nadia has a question.
We have here one question from Zoom. Sven Voss says, "Hi Fritz, thank you for a lovely talk. I know your and Jawor's group quite well. Simulation models that integrate stakeholders directly, role-playing games, are another focus of the group. Do you see further opportunities to turn maps into games that explore futures?"
Turning maps into games, that's a good idea.
Yes and no. We've been discussing that a lot, and like there's like, let's say, the gaming community has some strong objections towards using, let's say, spatially explicit maps, because from their point of view, it kind of distracts from the general issue towards like more detailed discussion about what is happening on the land. So at least the people in our group who do the gaming part like don't like to work on explicit maps. But that doesn't mean elements of my work couldn't feed into that. Like, for example, our visualization tools, I think they are very useful to inform gaming processes, if not kind of to build the game on top of it, but to kind of frame the overall context. So, so for that, it is useful, and there's more ways to explore to bring it together.
Oh, yes, interesting approach. I also have a question, not for the gaming and the maps, but for this tool of measuring complexity of programs or issues. Who is supposed to use this tool? Are these researchers or policymakers at a high level, or local people for evaluations, or what it is meant for?
Well, so first of all, we developed this together. I didn't mention it because I was running out of time. We developed together with the CGIAR, which is like the Global Agriculture Cooperation Research Center. And they saw the need for such a tool for their work, but especially for their work with project managers on the ground. So this is not so much meant, like the drone imagery, I really think this is something that people can interact with, but this mixing board is more, let's say, at the intermediate level, where planners, like people who run projects, who start new projects, they can somehow see where are we, like and also where do we want to be. And so far, it was always difficult, like to gauge, because when we talk about participation and inclusiveness, like it's very difficult to even grasp that, because it is fuzzy term. I think you said it just now, and that somehow helps during a process to say, oh, we're here and we maybe want to go more there, like basically a monitoring tool, but also for planning future projects to see what are our possibilities actually, how much resources do we have to put into this.
So it's really kind of a balanced scorecard for ecological programs.
Something like this, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there is another card.
Thanks for the presentation. My question relates to this graphs you showed about the abstractiveness and the scale. And I was wondering how it is linked with the stakeholders. You know, so different scale means different stakeholders and so on. And can you comment a little bit on that, according to your experience?
Yes, exactly. Like different scales have different meaning for different stakeholders. The problem is always when it gets mixed up, and that happens a lot. That, like, because it is so much more kind of attractive to publish a global map of something, often these are misused for quite local decision making. And I mean, I showed the map of this global restoration priorities, and that's like one of the examples where it looks like all our restoration needs, let's say globally, are kind of pushed towards the global south. So that's what all the red areas that came out up as highest restoration priorities. But that can actually be really alienating to people living there who say, well, it's not our duty to make up for your pollution and emissions over the last 100 years. And that is the problem when like that science is a bit like kind of not very explicit about what kind of tool is meant for what kind of purpose. And what I was trying with this graph, I mean, it was like, of course, a bit constructed, but like that we need different tools and approaches for different scales, and they all have their meaning. No? Like they're not useless, but we need to be very clear what are they targeting at, and that's what I try to show with this.
Yeah, thank you. I was told that somewhere here in the front line. Yeah, Johan, you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this great talk. I had another question regarding inclusivity. These tools can help a lot with that. And among the pictures you showed, very often it's forms of workshops or group processes where you interact with groups of people. And I imagine group dynamics can sort of create problems for inclusivity, where it's going to be people who are more used to speaking out and things like that, that might have their opinion taken into account. So I just wondered to which point this created problems potentially, and do you have any ideas for the future in regards to higher inclusivity, in regards to these group dynamics?
You mean from my own experience or from like
your own experience, and whether it's you have ideas for the future that could create tools that are of higher access to, for example, online tools, but that creates other problems.
Yeah, because in a way this is like not to avoid conflicts. Like I don't think it should be the goal to avoid conflicts. Like it's more to actually have a way to channel conflicts and to to understand them. Like not, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's like. Of course, group dynamics are always there, and there's different stakeholders who have very strong interests, and these interests will not necessarily change. But the first start is actually to enable people to understand other perspectives. And that's, I think, the most important thing, like that many conflicts actually remain at the level where people are like, I have my opinion, you have your opinion, we can fight, but, and mostly it's a fight about resources. But very often I don't even kind of get into what is the interest of the other person. And that's what these tools, amongst others, no? Like should help to actually allow people to even understand what is it that we're fighting about, and that then hopefully will help to let's say link the interests. Yeah, and both, I think it's a spatial thing that we need to understand what are we fighting about on the, let's say, on the ground, and also at the abstraction of a map, but also more at the like who has which power in the process, and that's the more, let's say, abstract mixing board example. Okay,
thank you very much. I think I have to close here because it is 12 o'clock. Everybody is hungry, but as far as I know, you will stay here for lunch, and so interested people can have lunch with Fritz and continue the discussion. Do you want to close? Or? Okay, so thank you very much, Fritz, and thank you to the audience.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a pleasure. Looking forward to the informal part.